So if Nixon was a jerk, Reagan was cut from a cloth even more conservative than Nixon ever could have dreamed. In fact, if you look at Nixon's policies and the laws that he passed, and you put them up against Reagan or George Herbert Walker Bush or George W. Bush, Nixon comes off like a tree-hugging socialist. I mean, he had incredible government programs based on the environment, based on many avenues of social justice. But he was a bigot, you know. Reagan was just a truly different type of character. But what's interesting is that both the Nixon and the Reagan administration were kind of advised and surrounded by the same kind of sleazy characters like George Herbert Walker Bush and Al Haig and people like that. Reagan was fairly racist as well. He really couldn't stand black people in any way. His 1980 campaign, when he ran for president the first time, he launched with a ringing endorsement of states' rights, and if you know what states' rights mean, it's political code speak for segregation. Okay, he launched his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, with a platform of states' rights. This is the place that the 3 civil rights workers were killed in 1964. So he decided to right the pendulum by starting his campaign down there, and he launched his theme and his message: "Big government doesn't work." And the example that he used was the welfare queen, who he described as a well-fed, drugged-up black woman driving a Cadillac paid by the government to have more babies. And this was a huge tool of his 1980 campaign. That big government doesn't work, and the reason it doesn't work is because of these welfare queens, and they're the reason. So essentially this welfare queen became a symbol for poor blacks everywhere and inner city blacks everywhere. So they were suddenly blamed with all of the economic malaise that hit us in the late 70s. So you got these racist Southern whites, and then you got the religious right, and they become the new base of the Republican Party. And they've ruled for essentially 30 years. More evidence. When AIDS began to ravage the gay and black communities first, Reagan wouldn't even say the word in public. He didn't say it in public until Nancy's favorite hairdresser died. And then that's when he finally came out and said it, but he wouldn't talk about black people. He was defiantly silent about it. So, so we got all this crack in these cities in the mid-80s, and people are killing themselves left, right, and center, and cities are falling apart. So the U.S. government responds politically with a new collection of federal laws called mandatory minimums. And that essentially differentiated between crack and powder cocaine. Now, why this is significant is because crack was something that was generally consumed by poor people in inner cities who were predominantly African American. Powder cocaine was much more expensive. It was generally consumed by affluent white people. Yet, if you had 5 grams of crack, you'd get the same sentence as if you had 50 grams of powder cocaine. If you had 500 grams of crack, it would give you the same thing as 5,000 grams of powder. These laws were a blatant political move by the Democratic Party at the time to look tougher on drugs than the Republicans. They did this by taking advantage of the 1986 overdose death of a young man named Len Bias. He was a college basketball star, and he was drafted by the Boston Celtics. He was to be a player on the order of Michael Jordan or Kobe Bryant. He was a truly gifted young man. And a few days after he had been drafted, he died of a cocaine overdose. He wasn't smoking crack. He was snorting high-grade shit with some people in New York. He had a heart condition, and he died of it. But if you've ever been to Boston, they're a little bit crazy there about their sports, like a little bit like crazy. And so the city went crazy. I mean, they were, as the Boston Globe put it, they were consumed with anger and dismay, and the papers were screaming for blood. Of course, it didn't help that, or it helped that the Speaker of the Democrat-controlled House at the time, and the most powerful man in the Democratic Party, was Democratic Congressman from Massachusetts, Thomas P. Tip O'Neill, right? So everywhere he went, he got harangued by everybody about the death of Len Bias, and what are you going to do about the drugs, and what are you going to do about the blacks, and what are you going to do about the crack? And so he pushed these mandatory minimums through without any review, without any public debate, without anything. A man named Eric Sterling, who sat on that committee, who's since dedicated his life to undoing these mandatory minimums, said that it was the most hasty, off-the-cuff piece of legislation they had ever passed. Yet, it had the most profound impact on federal drug spending and the federal prison population of anything during the war on drugs. By 1995, not one white person had been prosecuted in federal court under the mandatory minimum laws. Not one. Hundreds and thousands of blacks had been in that time. So 20 years later, in a piece in Rolling Stone called How America Lost the War on Drugs, the writer Ben Wallace-Wells framed it this way: that this misguided policy hit inner-city crack users with penalties as severe as those levied on Wall Street brokers possessing 100 times more, so that over the next 2 decades, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Americans will be locked up for drug offenses. So Reagan got Alzheimer's and slept through the last couple of years of his presidency, and in comes George Herbert Walker Bush in 1989. In October of '89, the Berlin Wall fell, and by 1991, the Cold War had screeched to a halt. During the Cold War, we had spent $15 trillion on nuclear weapons, military armaments, and all of the above, in order to craft this gigantic defense complex. Well, overnight we found ourselves without an enemy to point this big thing at. Suddenly millions of dollars and millions of jobs hung in the balance. So, under Reagan, what had happened is that Reagan's revolution, his miracle, his economic miracle, was based on deregulated markets, banking and corporate mergers and stuff. And so what he did was he eliminated social spending. He got rid of all the social infrastructure that the previous economic system had created, which is welfare and housing, all of these things. And he dumped all of that, including money that he borrowed from Japan mostly, Saudi Arabia, and put it into the defense industry. And so he kickstarted the economy by building thousands more nuclear weapons and aircraft carriers and fighter jets and guns and missiles and everything. Now, all of a sudden, without a Soviet Union, it looked like this whole system was going to be called into question. People were whispering peace dividend, right? Which meant, isn't it time to reap the rewards of finally finding global peace? People were asking whether we needed this vast and powerful military anymore. You know, we didn't have any enemies. Why? People wanted something different. The Cold War was 50 years long, and they were over it. Unfortunately, it's proved much more difficult to create something different with the economy than American people really understood. During the Great Depression, our government and the business sector in particular learned that a private capitalist economy has to have massive state subsidies in order to operate, which are price controls and government money injected into various aspects of the economy in order to keep it afloat. We did this through military spending, trillions of dollars worth of military spending. And it also led to the development of some of the most dominant tools in our economy today, which includes computers. The internet was developed by DARPA, which is the Defense Advanced Research Project Association, or agency, I'm sorry. Aeronautical industry, medical and pharmaceutical industry, these were all developed within the military system. So the response of the first Bush administration was to quickly shift as much of the defense apparatus as possible into the war on drugs that Reagan had amplified in order to turn it into a real live war. This was politically advantageous, if not a literal godsend for George Herbert Walker Bush, who found himself in a bit of a bind as he came into office, since he, quote, had his fingerprints all over both sides of the Iran-Contra affair, including the nagging issue of cocaine trafficking.